So at the end of the previous lesson, what we did was spend a little bit of time talking about the nature of synthetic a priori knowledge. And we noted that, according to Kant, synthetic a priori knowledge allows for humans to make meaningful statements about reality, about the world, without the necessity to rely on experience, empirical experience. And I noted the idea and the example of a bachelor being an unmarried man. Another example could be the statement that a triangle has three sides. Now, the reason why this is an a priori claim is because if I know what the definition of a triangle is, I don't need to go out and measure every single triangle and to count how many sides each and every single triangle has in order for me to come to a conclusion that a triangle has three sides, because the very definition of a triangle is a shape with three sides. And so we talked a little bit about the epistemological implications and some of the things relating to knowledge that Kant incorporates into his philosophy. This lesson is going to continue this by looking at his conceptualizations of knowledge more generally and in more detail, looking at some specific elements of it. So the previous lesson spent a lot of time talking about the nature of transcendental idealism, one of the most foundational theories of Kantian philosophy. This lesson is going to examine the Kantian approaches to epistemology and knowledge. So Kant on knowledge is a very interesting set of philosophical principles, namely because it fundamentally is interwoven to an extent on his metaphysical principles, things like transcendental idealism. And to begin with then, in Critique of Pure Reason, which was revised in 1787 but originally published in 1781, Kant addresses the limitations as well as the general scope of human knowledge and how human knowledge essentially works according to his theories. And he concludes that we can delineate knowledge into two distinct categories. You have what we mentioned previously, this idea of a priori knowledge which is independent of experience. So, for example, mathematical axioms, mathematical truths, statements which are tautological are fundamentally a priori in nature, because essentially you don't need experience to come to conclusions about the meaning and the truth value of statements which are a priori in nature. You also have a posteriori knowledge, which is knowledge which, according to Kant, arises from experience. So it is essentially the opposite of a priori knowledge that comes from experience, okay? So if I wanted to know if every person in Bristol today is wearing a blue hat, that is not knowledge that I can gain, that I can gather independent of experience. I'd have to go and have a look. I'd have to go and have a look at every single person to see if they are wearing a blue hat. I would probably conclude that probably not, but I can't be sure. I can't know with 100% accuracy unless I go and find every person in Bristol and see if they've got a blue hat on or not. So in order to have valuable truth about such a statement of that kind of nature, I would have to go and experience it. I'd have to go and measure empirically whether or not that is the case, which means that it is knowledge which I cannot gain and I cannot derive independent of experience. Kant would propose then that the human mind has inherent categories that structures our own experiences. And these categories include things like causality and things like substance, are not actually derived from experience, but they are still nevertheless very, very much necessary for making sense of these ideas of experience. They shape the way in which we interpret sensory data to essentially formulate coherent knowledge. This is what he described, and fundamentally, we can see the comparisons, and we can sort of see the historical foundations from which these ideas essentially start to see a shift in perspective, because we can compare it to other things that are taking place in and around the time at which Kant was alive, or maybe slightly earlier than when Kant was alive. So things like, for example, the Copernican revolutions in astronomy. Just as, for example, Copernicus proposed that the Earth revolves around the Sun rather than the Sun revolving around the Earth, Kant proposed that objects of knowledge can conform to our modes of perception and understanding, rather than our modes of perception and understanding conforming to the objects of knowledge, rather than the other way around. So we can see that essentially what Kant is doing is a similar thing to that of Copernicus and his revolution in astronomy, essentially looking at reality, looking at the way the world works. And in the case of Copernicus, it's obviously the way astronomy works and the way the solar system is structured. In the case of Kant, is the way knowledge is codified and knowledge is perceived and understood. And so, just like with Copernicus, he is viewing the ways in which the solar system operates from a completely different perspective to that of everybody else. And so too is Kant, looking at the way in which knowledge is understood and perceived from the other way around, proposing that the objects of knowledge conforms to our perception rather than our perception or understanding conforming to the objects of knowledge. Along this similar line of argumentation, then, a type of knowledge that Kant speaks of is this idea of empirical knowledge. Empirical knowledge being deriving from sensory experience and through the use of observation. Think back to my example of Bristol and the blue hats, looking for how many blue hats existed in Bristol, or if anybody had a blue hat in Bristol. I would require empirical knowledge. I'd require sensory experience and observation in order to essentially come to a conclusion about whether or not the statement "everybody in Bristol has a blue hat" is true or false. I can be relatively confident in my answer on the basis of my prior knowledge and experience of, firstly, the rate of people that have blue hats, the number of people that wear hats generally, and the sort of high standard that would be required to essentially prove the truth value of that statement, that everybody has a blue hat in Bristol. I could be quite confident that the answer to that question, whether or not it is true, is no, it's actually false. But I could never know for sure until I actually went and derived that sensory experience and observation. Essentially, I could never know for sure until I actually was able to look with my empirical knowledge. Kant therefore acknowledges the importance of empirical data, but still nevertheless argues that it always has to be interpreted through the categories of understanding. So whereas, as I mentioned in the previous slide, people would think that the categories of understanding, our understanding and our ideas related to perception, would change and would shift on account of the empirical knowledge and observation that we essentially do, Kant believed that empirical knowledge goes through a lens, it goes through a process of being interpreted through the categories of understanding. On the other hand, however, Kant acknowledges that there is also the idea of rational knowledge, knowledge which is derived from reason alone, a little bit like a priori knowledge. And he argues that this idea of rational knowledge, such as logical principles and mathematical principles, is essential for organizing and interpreting empirical data. If you were to go deeper and deeper and deeper into the philosophy of perception, we've done a couple of lessons on that already previously, but if you were to continue to go deeper and deeper into the philosophy of perception, or if you were to do something akin to a Cartesian methodological skepticism, you might find yourself questioning whether or not you can even perceive the world as it is. And just like Kant says, you can't perceive the world as it is because of this idea of phenomena versus the ways in which the world actually objectively is perceived. The way in which the world actually exists. And so, in doing so, you become quite nihilistic about what you can actually ever truly know through the use of empirical knowledge and through sensory experience and observation. But this is really where you then will put greater emphasis potentially on the value of rational knowledge that you can derive from mathematical and logical principles. If I know, for example, that the definition of a triangle has three sides, I can know rationally through a priori rationality and through reasoning and organizing my knowledge, I can know that every single triangle has three sides. So that the statement, a triangle has three sides, I can know to be true using my rationality, using my knowledge that is derived through reason alone. I don't need my sensory experience to come to a conclusion about that.